Here on the 10th anniversary of Occupy Wall Street to discuss its legacy, Professor Richard Wolff, economist, author, and host of Economic Update on YouTube and radio stations across the country. Welcome to the program, Professor Wolff.
Thank you, Juliana. Really glad to be here.
You know, I remember I interviewed you at the time of the movement, and you gave the famous Lenin quote to me. There are decades where nothing happens, and then there are weeks where decades happen.
Right.
Did Occupy take you by surprise at that moment?
Yes and no. I know that's a frustrating answer, but it really is the truth. I like to say to people, because it's important, that if the young folks who had organized Occupy had come to me, they didn't, but had they come to me in the preceding summer, the summer of 2011, and said to me, here's our plan. We're going to set up some tents down in that Zuccotti Park. And I would have listened politely, because I always have a fellow feeling, if I could say so, for people who have whatever it takes to get out there and do something. I mean, for me, that already raises them to the level of, I want to be your friend, kind of thing. But I would have said to them, look, no one's going to pay attention. It's going to be a non-event. And so I tell them that because I want them to know that people like me, who may be older than them, don't necessarily understand at all where things are. We try to, but we miss as often as we hit. And I would have been dead wrong. I mean, who would have imagined in June or July of that year that if you put up some tents in Zuccotti Park, within weeks, 300 cities across the United States would have done something like that. So, yes, I was surprised. But then on the other hand, no, I wasn't. And I tell you why. For many years, but particularly after the global crash of 2008. So let's say the years 2008, 9, 10, 11. During those years, in a number of European countries, France, Greece, Italy, I remember them there, but in other parts of Europe as well, there were huge demonstrations of angry people about an economic system that could crash like that, could throw millions of people out of work, lose them their homes. And remember, in Europe, people get much more social services than they get in the United States. They're not linked to their jobs. You know, my family's French. You're covered by medical insurance from the day you're born to the day you die. It doesn't matter who you work for. It doesn't matter whether you're employed or not. That's considered a human right. Everybody has that.
So sounds humane.
Yes, of course. And especially when you're unemployed, you need that all the more. Anyway, they all had demonstrations. They all had, in Greece, it amounted to the throwing out of the old political system, and a group of socialists, the Syriza party, some of you may remember, taking power in Greece and able to really make a difference, or moving in that direction anyway. So I knew that would happen in the United States. I felt very confident. We are backward politically relative to Europe. We have been for a long time. Their unions are stronger. They have powerful socialist and communist parties that are in the government from time to time. It's a different political world. So I knew it would happen sooner, but I wasn't surprised that it eventually happened here, but I was particularly surprised in the way that it happened, who made it happen, how it unfolded. So, my answer is yes and no.
We had Jay Ponte on the show recently to talk about his recent book, which discusses the very obvious through lines between Occupy, the organizers on the ground at Occupy, and Bernie Sanders' rise to be his two presidential bids, and AOC and the others like them, like the progressive folks who have been running. Talk about what you see as the lasting legacy of the Occupy Wall Street movement.
Yes, for me, Occupy was an absolutely crucial turning point. In a way, I've said it already, one way, it's the United States catching up in a way to Europe. catching up to a place that's more politically advanced, particularly on the left, than the United States. But there's another way to say that, which I think is more directed at the US. And that is, if you look at American left politics, it has a long history of being very critical of our capitalist system. Whether you look at the IWW, early years of the AFL, or you look at Eugene Victor Debs, the American Socialist Party, it happened from 1880, say, to the First World War. We had a strong socialist, anti-capitalist tradition. But after World War I, the community here, frightened by the socialist gains in previous decades, really came down the left. Those are the years of Sacco and Van Zandt, years of the Palmer raids, Boston, the 1920s of the left of the time. But then, and the history is important here, then in the 1930s, when capitalism collapses with the Great Depression in 1929, the left shows you can put it down, but you can't knock it out. It comes back stronger than ever. We have the greatest unionizing drive, the greatest surge of the socialist and communist parties. But once again, the business community, once World War II was over, 1945, came down on the left with McCarthyism and anti-communism and all of that stuff. And the reason I mention it is from 1945, and I would say all the way to 2011, that's more than half a century, the left in America could not say anything about capitalism that was critical, with the exception of a few far left groups that had virtually no influence. If people were critical of society, they could talk. It was difficult, but you could talk about racism. You could talk about sexism. You could talk about the environment. You could talk about nuclear war. But you were very careful not to attack capitalism, not to be critical economically. And the reason was simple. It was the Cold War. Anybody who was critical of capitalism was immediately tarred and feathered as an apologist for the Soviet Union, our great enemy, blah, 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 all of that. That lasted from 1945-6, when it started, all the way up, and I'm going to exaggerate, but not much, until Occupy Wall Street. And Occupy Wall Street stunned everybody who'd been around for a while, because they put right up front and center the 1% versus the 99%. Within weeks, President Obama at the time was using that language too. He took that language. I'd never seen that before, suddenly. And that's why the Lenin quote that you started with is so appropriate. Suddenly, what was unthinkable, let alone sayable, was everyday conversation on the front page of newspapers, in the mouth of the President of the United States, etc., etc. They overcame a 75-year taboo. That's an amazing achievement. And I would go even further than your earlier guest. I don't think Bernie or Ocasio-Cortez, and I don't want to take away from anything that those folks have accomplished, but I think if they were sitting here, they would agree that would not have been possible without Occupy Wall Street, because it showed everybody, and above all the people involved in Occupy Wall Street, how many they were, how strong they were, that the attempt of the right wing in America to say that there were no socialists here. I remember when I was a student in college, one of my courses opened with the professor saying, this course is going to examine why there never was, is not now, and never could be any socialism in America. I mean, and he spoke that with the confidence that you usually associate with morons, right? You know, I mean, it's whoa, you know. it was the thing we were all supposed to nod to each other. Oh, yeah, yeah. And now we were going to learn why that was. They blew all that up. Occupy taught itself. We are many. We are able overnight in cities crisscrossing the country to stimulate, to inspire people like ourselves. I was invited. I was very honored. I was invited several times to give talks in Zuccotti Park to the assembled people, which I did. I was brought up to Bangor, Maine. They had set up an Occupy Wall Street with tents in the middle of that. It's one of the few cities in the state of Maine, but Bangor had an encampment for Occupy. I spoke to them. I did it in New Jersey. I did it in a few places, and I could see for myself that people were astonished. When I would talk at Zuccotti Park, I remember coming home and telling my wife, it was interesting because what people were doing was they were listening to me, I think, but they were looking sideways. And I remember asking a couple of people, am I missing something? And the answers, which were very instructive to me, no, we don't know who these people are. We thought we would come out here and see all the usual people that come out in New York City anyway to demonstrations, but it's all these, and then the words were new people, all the new people. And indeed, when I entered, a few of them spoke with me after I finished my talks. They were often middle-level executives coming out of the office buildings. Zuccotti Park is right in the middle of the Wall Street area, and it's surrounded by monstrous tall buildings full of stockbrokers and lawyers and architects and all of that. And people were coming out for lunch because they wanted to have on nice days to eat their sandwich and their drink and kind of participate, not quite in the middle, but on the edges. And then what really showed me that something was extraordinary was my daughter at the time was a young woman, single, and I discovered that her dates, she was going out on dates like young women her age in New York City do, and the preferred place that the young men who took her out wanted to go was Zuccotti Park. It was a date place. And I said to myself, oh boy, if young people think the cool thing to do is to go on a date to a demonstration, we're living in a different country.
That's fascinating, Professor Wolff. Thank you for sharing that story. As someone who has obviously been around the left for a long time, can you give me the response of your perception of the response of like the older left, that what you said about being able to talk about anti-capitalism, being able to talk about the class warfare, class consciousness even? Most of those conversations were happening like at the Brecht Forum in New York. They weren't happening out on, first HBO and then other channel, Democracy Now, then HBO, then other channels started to cover it. What kind of response did people who've been trying to get this stuff across for the last 30 years have?
Well, you had quite a range of responses. I was very interested in the same issue, so I paid a lot of attention. So let me tell you what I learned as I talked to people. There was one part of the old left that was so excited, so pleased, so happy. This was what they had missed for 40, 50, 60 years. This is what they had hoped. This is what they had assured one another would eventually come. But by now, it had been a long time and it hadn't come. And yes, they supported civil rights struggles and feminism, and so they got that. But the kind of tried and true 99% versus 1% working people against what in France is called the patronat, the bosses, basically. They loved it. So that's one part of it. They gave money, they gave support, they cheered them on. So that was one group. Then there was a second group, usually associated with the old left political parties in the United States. And they were scandalized. That's the only word I can think of.
Really?
Yeah, what scandalized them, and by the way, there's some overlap. They were happy to see it, but they were horrified by the hostility to organization, by the insistence. If you remember Zuccotti Park, nobody was in charge. Nobody was elected to be the poobah who ran everything. And it
Yes,
was really very impressive. They were, in fact, organized, but not hierarchically. They really must have. I remember it was always women, by the way. That was another thing. It was, in my experience, I gave talks, I believe, 3, maybe 4 times. Before each of my talks, I was prepped. A young woman, I would say usually in the 30 to 45 year age range, would arrange to meet me somewhere, usually a coffee shop, and she would be dressed in what I call, a women's office attire, just so. And she would have a nice yellow legal pad, and she would have written down there what she wants to go through with me. It was very organized, very well organized. These young women knew exactly. I was very impressed. But, you had to be inside to see that. On the outside, it was, kind of chaotic in the park. There were lots of street people who were coming because they gave out free meals. They gave you music. They gave you a sense of being welcome. I mean, it was beautiful in its own way, but it didn't have the structure that these older leftists assume you've got to have or you'll never get anywhere. And so there was tension there. There was definitely tension.
Sure. Actually, even within the movement at the park, there was tension about that structure. And the idea was, if we don't have any heads of the Hydra, they can't come and cut it off,
Right.
So that was the idea. Yeah, that quote.
After I talked, I would sometimes be approached by people who would ask me some questions about my talk, and then they'd want to know who contacted, who invited, how did this get done? And I never answered the question. I mean, I don't on principle anyway, because I'm assuming half of these questions are coming from the police department, and I'm not going to do that. But even if they weren't, I didn't.
They were.
I didn't know what the answer. I didn't even know what the answer was. Sometimes these young women would introduce themselves. Hello, I'm Susan, but they would leave off the last name, and I figured that this was intentional, and that I didn't need to know. It's not relevant to it.
Well, I think a lot of it was also trying to keep sort of the ego out of it. That it went up the chain and became Bernie Sanders hashtag, not me, us, right?
Yeah.
He wanted to be part of a group, part of a movement, and not necessarily the head of it, which I thought was interesting. I do suggest everyone read Jay's book, because as I was reading it, it talked about the actual organizers who were organizing at Zuccotti Park, organizing in LA, did all of this organizing to push Bernie to run. He wasn't going to run until they pushed and pushed and pushed. And then he kind of, I think he saw the writing on the wall and went for it. So it's really interesting to be able to draw those lines.
Yeah, I know him a little bit, and I know his wife Jane a little bit. There was a lot of agonizing about whether or not to do it. And one of the reasons was that he has worked closely with the Democratic Party leadership. I know some of the people in the Democratic Party leadership, and I tell the following story, which is early on, after Bernie had announced, I happened to have, for other reasons, a cup of coffee with a very high official of the Democratic Party here in the United States. And I asked, I've known this fellow for a long time. I asked him, are you worried about Bernie entering the race? Oh, no, he said. He'll get his 1%, maybe 1.5%. That's not going to make a difference, given the way we see it. And I tell the story simply to explain to people, A, nobody knew. And number two, that he had been told these stories over and over again for years. And, the struggle for Bernie was, if he goes out there and he gets 1%, he will inadvertently have fed into the very notion that a socialism is impossible, that a socialism is out of the question, and he would make it harder for the next one. So yes, if he could break through, which he eventually did, then it would be a big plus, but it would also be a very depressing minus if what was expected. And these were people who knew Bernie and who worked with Bernie in the Democratic Party. And I think that made it very hard for him. But in my mind, no question, Occupy created the momentum that Bernie then cashed in on. I have no doubt about it at all.
It certainly seems like it seems to me the conversation around economic inequality and capitalism. Do you think, this is a hunch and I want to hear your thoughts about it. Do you think that any of that rhetoric fed into the populism that actually eventually wound up helping President Trump get elected? Because people wanted Bernie. Some of those people would have even voted for Bernie. We know what happened with the Democratic Party, not really, rigging it, for lack of a stronger term right now, against him. And so a lot of those people went over to vote for Trump. Do you see any connection between Occupy Wall Street, the populism there, and the inadvertent election of Donald Trump by angry people who have been disenfranchised by the economic system?
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of that going on. It's very hard to nail it down. You ask people, you don't know quite what their answer means. But in my own opinion, watching things, absolutely. You have a working class in America that is being squeezed. It's being squeezed for the last 40 years. Most people kind of know it. Either the job has left to go overseas, or the job has left, you get replaced by a computer or by a robot or by artificial intelligence. Between what the technology does to jobs and what the outsourcing overseas does, millions and millions of Americans lost their work, lost the work of someone in their family, which impacted the rest of the family in all the ways that does. And you had people very upset and very angry. Now, the question is, in this country, what do you do with that? Where does that anger, that upset go? And in our country, we stifle social criticism. We stifle the ability of people to say, we live in a system that is screwing us, and so the solution is to change the system. I mean, that isn't a complicated idea, but in our society, that's taboo. You could sooner talk about, sex or other taboo topics than you could deal with that. So it has to go somewhere. I like to use the example of England. England, very clever. The conservatives didn't want it to turn against the government because that's what they were. They were in the government. They didn't want that. So they came up with the brilliant idea. It's the government, but not this one. Europe over there. Hate them. So they did Brexit. The working class of Britain screwed worse than the American working class since 2008. Significantly worse. Horrible what's happened to the British working class. But they took their anger out by blaming Europe. They voted to separate from Europe. They are now separated from Europe, and they're in the worst condition imaginable in that society. That society makes this one look good, and that is not easy, economically speaking, these days. So Bernie comes along and says, no, there is this other way to direct your anger, directed at the big corporations, directed at the way this system is organized. And I'm going to lead you in that direction. Well, that's very nice. People begin to go there, but then someone reminds them about how bad socialism is, something they've learned since they were 2 years old, et cetera. Now, where are they going to go? Think of it almost as people being driven. Okay, they like that. Oh, but they can't go there. And Trump says, "Hey, I
How
got
about the blacks? Yeah.
I got a way from you for
How
you
about the
to
Latinos?
vent all your anger, even a little bit at the big businesses that are taking jobs away." Remember how Trump does that? He dances around the Harley Davidson factory,
Mm.
pretending that what he's going to do is going to make a difference. By the way, never did. But
Hmm.
it was good theater. It got him a little bit of the Bernie kind of support. And meanwhile, he could find the real scapegoats to unload anger on: the immigrant, the woman, the black, the standard candidates for that in
Right.
this country. So, yeah, I think in that way, Bernie helped to develop the very bitterness, the anger, which you now see in the social divisions that are tearing this society apart.
It's very interesting because had the Democrats allowed the election to play out organically, Bernie may have won
Absolutely. Look, the
both times.
progressives, with all their complications and all their weaknesses, and so the progressives are the life, the power, the strength of the Democratic Party. They squashed them. The Republican, the establishment did, the Clintons, the Obamas, all of that. In the Republican Party, they tried to squash Trump and they failed. Trump went around them. Trump was able to basically throw them out the window or make them be his toadies. Lindsey Graham, I mean, unspeakable kind of opportunism that even for those of us who are used to opportunism, we do have to take our hat off. This
Mm.
man, he takes the cake. But for me, I can see that had they dared to give this progressive wing its head, let them go, they would have been a very, very powerful. They're the only equivalent to what the Trumpers, the evangelicals that are part of that movement and that intensity and that time and that commitment. Um, that's what a minority can do
It's
in a system like this. And the progressives on the left are. That's another thing is important to understand. Demographically, the progressives on the left are larger in number than the extremists on the right.
it's interesting because having been to Zuccotti Park and having seen just the platforms that the people want passed, and there are platforms and the progressive platforms, those are loving brotherly love type of
Absolutely.
platforms, and the Trump people are just like death cult, hate, 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 hate. It's just it's so black and white. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, it's a wonder for me. I mean, I'm not a religious person, but it's a wonder for me the adaptation. I'm being as polite as I know how. The
Yes.
adaptation
Mm.
of people who refer to themselves as good or strict or committed
Right.
Christians, able to say about immigrant children or desperate refugees in a foreign country the kinds of things that come out of their mouths, you realize two
Profe-
things: that Christian commitment is pretty, how shall I put it? That's a
thin,
veneer,
thin.
and under thin, yeah, very thin. And underneath it, equally impressive to me, is a level of anger and bitterness and rage. And I keep thinking, as a political person, if only that intensity could be targeted somewhere else, it could have a positive social outcome instead of this kind of horrific. It is instructive to watch, not that I'm recommending it, but to watch Tucker Carlson. And
Oh,
it's because he's, as far as I can see, he's the mouthpiece that doesn't hold back, that just says whatever that kind of extreme right wing mentality can think of.
mm.
But it is so haphazard, it is so all over the place that it's not sustainable. If I
Richard,
was,
I had a conversation with a religious zealoty in-law who, when she was like, "Well, you can't, you don't know what," and I said, she's like, well, everyone, both sides have bad things. And I'm like, okay. And then she said, I don't think Trump was so bad. And I said, he had children in cages. Is that in your Bible? I couldn't take it anymore. I just couldn't take it. And she's like, well, Obama did it first. And luckily, I knew exactly what went on. And so I explained it to her. But when someone comes back with a talking point like that, so it's genius propaganda that they got from Fox News, and you are just a normal person. You're not like making a show on TV about politics. Maybe you don't know the actual answer, and you just get kind of shut down. And it was the thing that stuck out. In addition to what you said, the veneer and the hate is that religions do not teach you to think for yourself. They teach you to read this book and follow it. This is what God said. This is what this guy said. Always a guy, and just follow that and don't think for yourself. So these people are just primed to be propagandized because they've been propagandized by their religious affiliations for, generations.
Yeah, they were not told that the hard part in life is to ask the question, not to give the answer that someone wrote down somewhere. Anybody can read it and memorize and give you the answer. The trick is to open yourself up and imagine alternatives and think about what might make them real. You do that often in your personal life, right? Somebody comes along and says, well, you should marry that person. You giggle, because you're not going to let someone tell you that. You're going to try to find your own partner, your own
Sure.
person to live with.
At least in the U.S.
Yes.
Professor Wolff, we're 10 years out. We're celebrating a 10-year anniversary of what I like to call the beginning of the Occupy movement, because these activists are still out there. I've heard it said that they use the quote to describe Occupy. They tried to bury us, but they didn't realize we were seeds. And so even act.tv actually grew out of the Occupy movement, and people who wanted a different media system got together and did this. So it is interesting to see what has grown out of it. What does history tell us? My final question to you today, and I do thank you for joining us. What does history tell us about movements a decade in?
It's a test. Movements that want to change society are always percolating. They're always, if not at the surface, just below the surface. And then they pop out. And the question is, like with seedlings, your example's good. It's like with seedlings. Time tells you whether the rain and the soil and the sun are enough for this seedling to make it through the first 6 days, then the next 4 weeks, and then become an immense oak tree or whatever it is that it ends up as. And I think political movements have always been the same. And what we now see is 10 years later, the thing that started with Occupy is much, much, much bigger. Let me give you me as an example. I began on the radio. I've never done radio before. I began with a radio program on a New York station, WBAI, in March of 2011. So here we are, literally a little over 10 years of me doing that. And now my program is on 100 radio stations. It's also a TV program, which it wasn't then. The TV program is on 4 different networks. If you add it all up, it goes out to millions and millions of American people every week for a half an hour. I started doing this on my own as a part-time addition to my job. Now it is my full-time job, and I have 2 full-time, 2 part-time, 2 half-time, and 2 contract people, all of whom are working with me to do. So for me, I'm shaking my head, and I'm a first-person witness. This is beyond anything I would have dared allow myself to imagine as a I have 240 last I looked, 240,000 YouTube followers. Okay, what's this going on? This isn't me. I'm not saying things that different from what I said 20 years ago. But 20 years ago, people in America weren't interested. Now they are. And that's an amazing testimony to that Occupy was indeed a seed that was planted in the right soil with the right sun and the right water at the right time.
Well, we thank you so much for joining us, and I do thank you for all that you do. I feel lucky to have crossed paths with you on the in the active sphere, whatever you want to call it, in New York,
Right.
and just having you a regular on this program has been wonderful. If you would like to follow Professor Wolff, do so on YouTube or even, I think, Twitter. Democracy at Work. Except without the O, WRK, Democracy at WRK on Twitter. The show is called Economic Update. You can find it on YouTube and definitely follow Professor Wolff there. Thanks again for joining us, Professor.
Thank you, Juliana. Glad to be here.